Assalamu alaikum class. Today we're going to start with our lecture number 5. That is, we're continuing with the theoretical framework, and we're moving on to talking about developing hypothesis statements. All right, let's start with the recap, what we did last session. Last session we talked about different types of variables, such as independent variable, dependent variable, the moderating and mediating variable, which is sometimes also called the intervening variable. So we talked about these different types of variables. Later on, what we did was we looked at different examples and how to identify within those examples these different variables. What we also looked at was that while discussing these different variables, we need to also look at the relationship between these different variables. We identified that while identifying the relationships, we could say that the relationship between certain variables is of a sort of a positive nature or a negative nature. We also looked at that we might be able to also look at the different the difference between the groups in terms of when a variable is being studied. Thereby we wanted to look at that this variable can have different values for different groups. Later on, what we also talked about was we talked about that while developing our theoretical framework, we need to talk about the variables, their logical relationships, the directions, and the explanations how these variables are related. We need to describe and discuss as to why these variables relate to each other. So, as we said that earlier, the general idea is that once we had identified a problem, what we'd like to do is break it down into a more simpler state that so that we can address that problem in a piecemeal way. And that is, we break down the problem into a way that we could address it in separately, and in that way we might be able to solve the problem. So we wanted to make sure that once the problem is stated in a way that it could be properly measured, and then at the later stage could be tested as to be to be true or false. Continuing with this theme in mind, let's look at this example where a production manager is concerned about the low output level of his employees. The articles that he read on the job performance frequently mentioned that three variables are important to the job performance, such as skills required by the job, rewards offered, and satisfaction. So while he was going through different literature, he came across that the performance of the employees are dependent on the skill required by the job, the rewards offered by the job, and the satisfaction of the employees. And in several articles it's also indicated later on then that only if the rewards were attractive to the recipient did the satisfaction and job performance increase, not otherwise. Meaning that for people who did not really seek rewards, or the rewards were not attractive to them, for them, in that scenario, the satisfaction and job performance increase was not seen. What we mean by that is, well, you can look at it through our schematic diagram, but later let's elaborate on this theoretical framework. That is what we want to do when we say in a theoretical framework. What we tend to do is, as I said, that we need to elaborate our variables, what they are, and the scenario I gave you earlier. What we need to do is, while developing our theoretical framework, considering the scenario which I presented earlier, we need to make sure that we elaborate at these different variables. While elaborating these different variables, that's when we are able to clearly understand the relationship. Because while studying the earlier portion, this one, the one I'm showing you right now, what you will find out is that some of these relationships are not as clearly defined as one would like to. So what we do is when we develop our theoretical framework is we elaborate and explain these variables and their relationships, such as when we look at the theoretical framework, I'm referring to the the para number 2, where it talks about rewards, where rewards are we start off explaining different variables. In the very initial, when we're developing our theoretical framework, what we tend to do is we explain the different variables, such as, like I'm doing it now, is that in the second paragraph I'm saying rewards are of 2 types, intrinsic and extrinsic, and we elaborate on the different types of rewards. And we can say that where job is enrichment, whereas job enrichment is something to do with making the job more challengeable. While elaborating on these things, what we can say is that rewards are known to enhance the satisfaction of employees, which leads to higher organization performance. And then we can elaborate a little bit on that. But we say that from some employees, the rewards are not attractive, hence no contribution of satisfaction of the employees is seen, meaning that when job enrichment is offered and rewards are offered, the general theory suggests when job enrichment and rewards are offered, the general theory states that the organization will have higher performance as compared to the theory which further elaborated that the employee's satisfaction will come in between. That is, once the job is enriched, rewards are offered, employees start to have higher satisfaction level, which later on converts into organizational performance. So whatever discussion we had earlier, or the description we had of the theoretical framework here, what we looked at in the second paragraph is we elaborated with different reward types. We talked about the different jobs challenges, which basically enhances the job, and then we talked about the relationship between these variables. While discussing this, then what we do is we convert the discussion and we develop the schematic diagram. While describing the schematic diagram, we also need to explain the role of attraction for rewards. We're saying that attraction for rewards is a moderating variable, whereby if the attraction for rewards is there, then only satisfaction will be achieved. That is, if it is for employees for them the attraction is there for rewards, those are the employees who will be more satisfied, and once they are satisfied, you will find higher organization performance from them. So considering these things, we basically looked at that there are 2 steps basically to developing a theoretical framework, 2 major steps. One is where you describe the different variables, the relationship with each other, elaborating them, explaining them, and supporting them with different references. And moving on, once you are able to explain them, then what you do is you schematically draw those relationships. And as you can see, while going through the description, where you need to maybe spend a page and a half describing what are the types of relationship, what is the types of variable they are, you convert that into a schematic diagram. Now this becomes much simpler to work with, and as you can see that here we are saying job enrichment and rewards lead to satisfaction, employee satisfaction, which is then converted into organization performance. And we are then saying that the rewards effect conversion to satisfaction is only possible for people or for the individuals who basically have attraction for the rewards. For the people who don't have attraction for the rewards, the satisfaction is not there. So what are the research questions we can draw from this scenario is, does job enrichment and rewards influence the performance? This is one of the research questions we want to address. Of course, we had theorized it. We have schematically drawn the scenario. But what we need to know is, at this stage, is to know and establish that does the job enrichment and reward influence performance? It's one thing. Another thing we would like to establish is, does the satisfaction of intervenes the relationship or not? That is, does satisfaction intervene the relation between reward and performance? And further on we can say, does satisfaction intervenes between the job enrichment and performance? And finally, one of our research questions could be, does the attractiveness of the rewards moderate the relationship between reward and satisfaction? So considering these 1, 2, 3, 4 query state questions, now what we need to do is develop our hypothesis statements. So the statements which can basically answer these questions in a way that they can prove, they can find answers, and the answers could be judged if they are true or incorrect. The hypothesis statements we can develop from these are, could be, let's look at some of the hypothesis statements here. These are some of the hypothesis statements we have developed. That job enrichment leads to higher job satisfaction. We're saying also that if rewards are offered, job satisfaction level will be high as well. Another hypothesis we can say is organization performance is affected by job enrichment through satisfaction. These are the sum of the hypotheses we wanted, and we said that hypothesis earlier basically helps us solve the problem what we have formulated earlier. So it's a logical, hypothesis statements are a logically placed relationship which needs to be tested. And this is which need to be tested, and we basically develop statements which are easily testable. So hypothesis statements basically is a way of stating the relationship in a way which can be later on tested by statistical methods. And so we say that while developing these statements, these hypothesis statements, we use different statistical tests to see if these statements are correct or incorrect. Okay, so let's, while defining hypothesis statements formally, we say hypothesis statements can be defined as a logically speculated relationship between two or more variables expressed in the form of testable statements. So we're saying hypotheses are logically developed relationship. We are saying speculated because speculated at this stage we're assuming that this is the kind of relation there is. We have not yet established in terms of in our own research that this relationship really exists or not. At this stage, when we're developing our hypothesis statements, we logically speculate the relationship between the two or more variables in such a way that we can test them. This is what a hypothesis statements is or statements are. Different hypothesis statements, which I said, we could have made from the theoretical framework, which is we looked at earlier here. Based on this theoretical framework, we can develop different hypothesis statements. The first hypothesis statement I'm just looking at right now, which is HA1. It says job enrichment leads to higher job satisfaction. Now, if we look at it, job enrichment leads to high job satisfaction. So we're looking at this particular relationship, and we're saying job enrichment will lead to high job satisfaction. So focusing on just this part. So our hypothesis 1 is basically dealing with this. We're saying job enrichment leads to higher satisfaction. Now, once we are able to satisfy this, then we move on to the other statements as well. So looking down, this is our first hypothesis statements we could make. Another statement is if rewards are offered, job satisfaction will be high as well. So the other we are looking at is we are saying rewards, we're trying to develop a relationship between rewards and employee satisfaction. We're saying rewards, the relationship between rewards and employee satisfaction. We want to establish that the higher the rewards, the higher the job satisfaction is. Now, if you note that comparing to what research questions were, which was saying the research questions were in the shape of a question that has job enrichment and reward and influence performance, or does satisfaction intervenes, or does the satisfaction does the attractiveness of reward moderate. All these are in the shape of a question. All in the shape of a question. These are all questions which need to address. But how do we do that? First of all, we tend to develop based on these research questions. We tend to develop our hypothesis statements. But the hypothesis statements, if you look at, these are statements. We are saying something. We're saying job enrichment leads to higher job satisfaction. We're saying if rewards are offered, job satisfaction will be high as well. Now these are statements. We're claiming something, but these are speculated training. These are speculated. You still have to prove, but these are statements nevertheless, as compared to the previous ones, which are, these are questions. Here we are trying to find out is the relationship between job satisfaction, there is a relationship between the reward and job satisfaction there. Is there a relationship between job enrichment and job satisfaction? Is there a relationship between rewards and organization performance? These are all questions which are basically driven from the literature and the theoretical framework which we had developed. So once we have these questions formulated, now we are ready to make some kind of statements as well. That is, some speculated statements that if rewards are offered, job satisfaction level will be high as well. Now, these are statements. We're claiming that if this is this, then this will happen. All now, the next step we need to do is we need to collect data on rewards and on job satisfaction and see if they are related or not. Once we are able to establish that, then we could say, yes, this statement is correct or this statement is wrong. So do you see the point now? So we basically started with a theoretical framework. We developed a theory. We theorized the variables. We basically defined the variables. We found the we described the relationship, the way we see in the literature, or the way we have observed, or the way we have found out in interviews. We then convert our these before we actually, and what we do is we convert them into the questions, research questions, which are basically need to be answered in order to solve the problem. And in the previous scenario, the problem is organization performance. So we're trying to find out what are the different factors which are influencing the job performance. And we've identified that there are 3 or 4 different variables which are influencing the job performance. And by probing, by questioning the different relationships, the relationship between these variables, we move forward and we move forward, and then what we do is make certain claims. We make certain hypothesis statements saying that this is the sort of relationship exists between these certain variables, such as rewards and job satisfaction, such as in job enrichment and job satisfaction. Okay, so once we make these claims, the next step, of course, logically is we have made these claims based on the literature. Now what we do is, the next thing is we need to make sure that we collect data and try to establish if these relations are true or not. So we're saying now once we have stated these relationships logically, as I said, we need to establish the link between them in a statistical manner. and we need to establish that the relationship between these variables exist through some statistical technique. We also need to identify a few things as to if the relationship is of a positive nature or a negative nature. But what we also need to do is we need to see if there is a positive correlation between is significant or not. So another thing we want to do while doing these testing these relationships is to find out if these variables are related. One thing, and the second thing we want to make sure is the relationship is significant or large enough that we could say that our hypothesis has been proven or not. Meaning, there could be a relationship between certain variables, but if it's a very weak relationship, then we might not be able to prove our hypothesis. So we need to also make sure that if the relationship exists, and we collect data for this, and we find out that there is a relationship, we need to also look at that if the relationship is strong enough. Is it significant enough? Is the relationship large enough to prove our hypothesis or not? Because if there is some kind of relationship, it might be very small, or minuscule, or very little, then we might not be able to say that our hypothesis is true. In social sciences, what we need to, we generally tend to say that we are confident that 95% of our times out of 100, the observed relationship will hold true. Generally, what we tend to do in social sciences is keep our significance level to 0.05, indicating that we are saying 95% of the time out of 100, the observed relationship will hold true. 5% of the time is possible that the relationship will not hold true. So when we say 0.05, what we mean by that is, or 0.05 significance level, is that we're saying 5% of the time of out of 100, we might not find the relationship as we had identified to hold true, but 95% time we will find the relationship to be true. But this is one of the criteria we generally tend to establish, and if there is a relationship between certain variables, we want to make sure that it is it teaches a certain significance level. It establishes certain significance level, and in our case, we said that generally in social sciences, in our case, we tend to keep it as to be at 0.05, which is we're saying 5% there is a chance of being that the hypothesis doesn't hold true, and 95% of the time it holds true. So it is true, our data analysis, our logical relationships are tests. So previously what we did was we had theoretical framework, research questions developed out of the theoretical framework. Then what we did was we developed our hypothesis statements, and to establish if our hypothesis statements are correct or not, what we do is we use statistical tests. Before we use our statistical test, naturally we need to collect certain data and apply those tests on our collected data. And generally what we tend to do is we tend to see if there is a relationship between these variables. How good is that? How large is that relationship? And for that we tend to set that the significance level for social sciences is 0.05, indicating that we want to make sure that 95% out of 100 the relationship we identified will hold true. So keeping these things in mind, in our hypothesis, we want to make sure that that our hypotheses are not proved. In case they are not proved, then we would like to search for possible reasons. That's another thing we want to look at, is although we try to collect data which might be which might support our hypothesis, meaning in the previous case we might find out that job enrichment leads to employee satisfaction, high employee satisfaction. We might be able to prove that relationship based on our data, but certain times if we are not able to do that, then we try to find out what the possible reasons are. What are the possible reasons that the hypothesis was not proven? So maybe based on that, we again extend our theory, like in the case when we looked at that the rewards would lead to high job satisfaction. Initially, maybe the theory was that, and the data, while looking at the data, we find out that rewards do not really sometimes influence the job satisfaction. On further research, if that is not proven, on further research we might need to find out what are the other variables influencing. In our case, in the previous case, what we found out was that for some employees, rewards is not an attractive option. So for them, if the rewards are not attractive option, then rewards will not lead to higher satisfaction. So in any case, whatever the hypothesis we develop, we need to make sure these hypotheses are tested based on the data collected. And once we are able to test these the hypotheses, there's a possibility some of the hypotheses will not be proven. For that matter, it is an indication that maybe either there is some more variables which need to be studied, and maybe they are influencing the relationship. So we need to expand our horizons, expand our search, and try to find certain explanations as to what. Different methods could be used. We can go back to the literature and search for different anomalies, different cases where the scenario doesn't work, or we can go back to specialists, experts, and talk to them that in their view what could be the different reasons. And once they are able to identify certain reasons, we might be able to find out that there are other than the normal variables which we are looking at in the study which are influencing as well. So as we said earlier, that in any case, literature provides us a lot of support to the hypothesis we have developed, and in any case, what literature does is it provides us the support as to why these relationships exist. And in case when the hypotheses are not proven, we need to again further look at different literature and maybe do more interviews and find out why in our case this relationship was not proven, although the previous theory did say that there is a relationship between these two variables. Okay, so now we'll talk a little more about what are the different hypothesis statements formats are. The hypothesis statement formats are the way we write these hypothesis statements. There are different ways of stating our hypothesis statements. The different hypothesis statements could be one is that we might be able to write a hypothesis statement which basically establishes a difference between groups. And the other type of hypothesis statements is where it tries to find the relationship between the variables, meaning we might have some hypothesis statements indicating that there's a difference between certain groups. This could be one type of hypothesis statement. Another hypothesis statement could be we're trying to say there's a relationship between different variables. We did not have too much discussion on the difference between the groups, type of hypothesis statements. In the coming slides, we'll talk a little more about that. But we did certainly talk about the relationship between the variables, the kind of hypothesis statements in which the relationship between variables have been talked about. Another way of another form of writing hypothesis statements is that that could be written in the form of a proposition, that is a suggestion, And one other could be we could write hypothesis statements in the form of if then else statements. Again, these are different formats. Both could be used depending on the preference of the researcher, but here we are trying to suggest that there is certain relationship, and sometimes again we could also use a way in which we can saying that if X increases then Y will decrease, which is again more or less in the same way we are saying the hypothesis statement, but here we are trying to be more mechanistic, more systematic in stating our relationship. Another way of format of hypothesis statements is where we have sort of directional and non-directional type of hypothesis statements, where we, in certain hypothesis statements, what we tend to do is give a direction in our statements as to if the relationship is positive or negative. That is when we are saying there is a relationship, and in another case when we are saying the relationship is there, but you're not mentioning the direction of the relationship, if it's positive or negative. We'll have a few examples of that in the coming slides. Another kind of format is when we are saying, as we said, that there could be statements which are basically focused on the difference between the groups. An example for that is that there is a difference between the motivation level of men and women. Here again, the focused area or the problem area is the motivation level. This is the variable we are studying. We're trying to find if the motivation level of the employees is the same. But the hypothesis we have formulated there is that there is a difference. The question could be, is there a difference between the motivation level of men and women? And the hypothesis statement for that kind of a question could be, there is a difference between the motivation level of men and women. Now again, this is a statement, full stop. We're saying there is a difference between the motivation level, but here we are focused area is motivation, but we are trying to divide it into two different groups, meaning men and women. So this is an example of a hypothesis statement where the group differences have been established on a specific variable, that is motivation. And if what one could really, if we would say, okay, what are the two variables we are focused here? What could say one is the motivation level and the other could be the gender, whereby we're trying to split motivation across the two genders, that is male and female. Got it? We're saying that there's a difference between the motivation level of men and women, men and women being the gender, and motivation level is the dependent variable which needs to be studied, which needs to be emphasized. So this is an example of the difference between the groups, and the focused area or the focus variable is the motivation level, or the broad problem area is the motivation level. This is what we are looking at. The example of a relationship between variables, you've looked at some of them. This is another example of that there is a relationship between age and job satisfaction. So two variables, you're looking at age and job satisfaction. We're saying there is a relationship. Here again, we're saying age and job satisfaction are related, meaning if we have an increase in age, job satisfaction will also increase, or if there is a decrease in age, job satisfaction will also decrease. Got the point? We're here saying that there is a relationship between these two variables, although the direction in this statement is not very obvious, but we are saying there is a relationship, but we're not claiming if it's a positive one or it's a negative one. We don't know. We're not sure here. We're not claiming this at this stage. So, but nevertheless, this is an example of a relationship type of a hypothesis statement. So the first one I looked at is, this is where we're stating there's a difference between certain groups, This is a type of statement which differentiates the groups on a certain variable. The second one is trying to define that there is a link between age and job satisfaction without claiming that if it's a positive one or a negative one, but there is a relationship which he's trying to claim here. So these are all claims which need to be proven at a later stage while collecting data. Example of a propositional style: employees who are more wealthy will take sick leaves less frequently. So this is an example of employees who are more healthy will take less sick leaves. So these are two wheels we're looking at. Employees healthy, and we're looking at sick leaves. We're saying this is a proposition way of style of writing it. We're saying employees who are more healthy will take sick leaves less frequently. Nevertheless, it is talking about a relationship, right? It's a relationship between these two variables, correct? Again, this is a way of writing it. You can also state in another format, which is if employees are more healthy, they will take sick leaves less, which is almost the same way, but the style is different. So depending on your preferences, you pick up this style or this style. But nevertheless, these are different ways of writing. We're saying if employees are more healthy, same thing, we'll take sick leaves. We're talking about sick leaves, so we're trying to again establish a relationship between these two variables. Okay, so based on these two, again, as I said, some of these relationships would be indicated, but sometimes these relationships do not have a direction given into them. The reason could be a number of reasons. It could be that sometimes while going through the literature review, you cannot or one could not establish with confirmation that if the direction is positive or negative. That is, there could be some findings in the literature which is indicating there is a positive relationship, and then there are also findings in the literature which might say that there is a negative relationship between them. And if the decision, if it's not conclusive, you cannot conclude that there is a positive relationship or negative relationship, then what you tend to do is you try to give the relationship, define the relationship in a way, and you say that the relationship is of sort of a non-directional. You say there is a relationship, but you're not claiming that there is a positive relationship or a negative relationship. So in that case, you don't use a directional kind of. But in case there is conclusive support that in the literature that there is a positive relationship, what you tend to do is then you generate your hypothesis in a way which is called the directional way or way of stating the hypothesis. So an example could be, the greater the stress experienced on the job, the lower the job satisfaction will be. We're saying the greater the stress experience, greater the stress, the lower the job satisfaction. I want you to focus on two of these variables here as well. These are the adjectives which are we adding. We are saying lower and greater. The two variables are again here stress and job satisfaction. We're trying to say there is a relationship between stress and job satisfaction, but at the same time we're qualifying it with the word greater and lower, indicating a negative relationship between these two variables. So we're saying, we're giving a direction, we're saying there is a relationship between these two variables such as stress and job satisfaction, but at the same time we're saying that the greater the stress, the lower the job satisfaction, indicating that the relationship is of a negative type. And this is again an example of a directional type of hypothesis statement. Let's have another look at the example with the group difference. We're saying the motivation level of women is more than the motivation level of men. Okay, if you remember, previously we were talking about motivation. We were saying the focus variable is motivation, and we want to split it and to find out between men and women. We wanted to find out if the difference between these two groups is the same or more. Here, if the literature which we had studied supports that the women generally tend to have more motivation level than the men, then here this statement is basically a directional statement, which is an example of group difference directional statement. The previous one was a relationship, but again a directional relationship statement. So both these examples are the examples of directional, but here we are looking at the group difference, indicating that women are more motivated than men. Okay, so we are not just saying that there is a difference between the motivation level of men and women, but we are saying that the women are more motivated. So we are making a claim, and we want to test that claim. If we don't have this, we don't have support for that kind of claim, then we tend to go with a non-directional way of stating our hypothesis. And what we have is, with that, we have a chance of getting that hypothesis corrected if we provide that there is no direction to that. But when we say if there is a directional, then the chances of being correct or making sure that the hypothesis is proved true, the chances are lower. We'll talk about that a little later, what I mean by that. But let's look at, and then more specifically, the non-directional way, where we're saying there is a relationship between stress and job. We're just saying there is a relationship between stress and job satisfaction. That's it. But we're not saying it's positive or it's negative. We're not sure. There's a difference between motivation level of men and women. Again, we're not saying it's greater than or it's less than. So we're not saying it's greater or less. We're not sure. When we are not sure, we use a non-directional way of writing it. When we are sure, then we use a directional way. And again, if it is all based on the support. Whenever we have support, conclusive support in the literature, then we tend to go with directional. In case there is no conclusive support for that, then we take a non-directional way of doing it. But directional hypothesis statements are more preferred as to non-directional. As I said earlier, that is the literature which supports the formation of hypothesis statement in the previous literature. And as the literature advances and the more there is support literature available, we are able to make statements with more formation or the more accuracy. So we need to make sure that basically if the research is at an advanced state, we might be able to make statements which are with more confirmation, with more firmness. Okay, so in the directional, as I said, in the directional relationship statement, we need to avoid non-directional in case when there is support for directional. Okay, another format of stating your hypothesis is through mentioning the null and alternate hypothesis statements. Null hypothesis is a proportion, it's a proposition that states a definite exact relationship between two variables, and it states that the population correlation between two variables is equals to 0 or some definite number, or the difference between the two groups is 0, which is basically we're saying that null hypothesis again is a proposition which basically is a definite exact relationship. We're saying there is when we say there is no relationship between two variables, what we mean by that is the relationship strength is equals to 0. There is no relationship, meaning the link between these two variables is equals to 0, meaning there is no relationship. When we say something like that, we are trying to make a definite give a definite number, which is we're saying it's equals to 0. When we say equals to 0, it means there's no relationship. And if we say there is no difference between the two groups, again we are saying the difference between two groups is 0. So in a null hypothesis, we tend to say that there is no relationship between the two variables, meaning the value of the relationship between the two, or the strength between the between the two variables is equals to 0, indicating there is no relationship. When we say it's 0, it's no relationship. And similarly, when we are saying that the relationship, that the difference between the two groups is equals to 0, we're saying there's no difference between the two groups. The value, or let's say in the case of motivation, the motivation level between men and women, the difference between the two is equals to 0. Similarly, when we're saying the relationship between stress and job satisfaction is equals to 0, meaning the stress and job satisfaction are not related at all. So one way of stating the hypothesis, once we develop what we call an alternate statement, and we call one the null statement. The alternate statement is usually what we call as the actual hypothesis statement. The alternate hypothesis statement is opposite to the null. It is the statement expressing the relationship between two variables, indicating the difference or the relationship between the two groups. It is the alternate statement. It's opposite to the null statement. When we're saying there is no relationship between certain variables, then the alternate statement could be that there is a relationship, there is a positive relationship, or there is a negative relationship. All these three statements which I gave you against the no relationship is that there is a relationship, there is a positive relationship, there is a negative relationship, but nevertheless there is a relationship. So when we say null hypothesis, the opposite to that is there is a relationship, and then we can qualify that it is positive relationship, negative relationship. Similarly, when we say there is no difference between the two groups, then again we are saying that the opposite to that is there is a difference between the two groups. Then we can further qualify that group A is more than group B, or group B is more than group A. Whatever the scenario it could be, we can qualify that later on, but there is a difference, or there is a. So usually what we tend to do is we define our hypothesis statements in two formats. One, the null hypothesis statement. The second, the alternate hypothesis statements. Null hypothesis statements, you tend to say that there is no relationship and there is no group difference. The logic behind that is what we tend to do is once we define the null hypothesis statements, and we what tend to do is we try to disprove the null hypothesis statement. Once we disprove the null hypothesis statements, it's easier for us to prove the alternate, meaning to disprove null is much easier. So what we need to do is, instead of developing our proving actual hypothesis statements, what we tend to do is develop a null hypothesis statement, which is a much simpler way of checking the relationship or the difference between the groups, because we are stating it in a way which is much easier to check. That is, if there is no relationship, then we are saying the relationship is equal to 0, or there is no difference, that is the group difference, the value is equal to 0. This is much easier to prove as compared to finding that there is a relationship, and the relationship is positive or negative, and if the relationship is significant enough or not, which is slightly more complex as compared to null hypothesis. So what we tend to do is we tend to generate a null hypothesis statements, which is based on that null hypothesis statements, we're trying to generate what we call as the alternate hypothesis statements. Null hypothesis statements, as we said, we're saying that there is no significant relationship between the two variables, or no significant difference between the two results. And alternate is stated that there is a significant relationship between the two variables or a significant difference between the two variables. So coming back again, this point, we're saying the null hypothesis is a statement where we are saying that there is no significant relationship between the two variables or no significant difference between the two groups. Alternate is we're saying there is a significant relationship and there is a significant difference between the two groups. As we said, the null hypotheses are formed with the objective of rejection. Once we reject, what we tend to do is the null hypothesis and all other alternate hypotheses can be supported. Once we are able to do that, it's easier for us to support all the alternate hypotheses. Again, whatever the hypotheses we have generated, they basically are driven from the theory or the literature. So it is the theory which gives us the faith that the alternate hypothesis is true, because in theory we've defined that there is a relationship. What is the relationship? Logically we talk about it, and then with the help of literature we support that logic and say that there is a relationship, and then what we tend to do is we tend to develop two types of hypotheses there, whereby we develop a null hypothesis and then the alternate hypothesis. Once we are able to reject the null hypothesis, we can say that the alternate is true, and not just true, but also because it's true that null is rejected, but because we have support from the literature as well. So by negating the null hypothesis, we are saying the alternate is true, one, and again what we have is that there is support for that in the literature as well. So this is how we go about improving our alternate hypothesis or our hypothesis journal. Okay, let's have a small exercise and talk about how we generate our hypothesis. Basically, this exercise is going to work on or try to establish, we're going to establish the theoretical framework, and based on the after developing the theoretical framework, what we'll do is try to develop the hypothesis statements. Generally, the scenario is that the people high in their need for achievement and who have high work ethic values will be highly motivated to work. When they get motivated, we say they slowly become involved in their jobs. So what we are saying here is that the need for achievement and work ethic values are the two independent variables that would account for the variance in the dependent variable of interest, which is the job involvement. So we're saying this relationship could be better understood through the intervening variable motivation. That is, those who have high need for achievement and accomplish things in their jobs would be motivated to engage in their work behavior, which is due course of time will get them to so absorbed in their doing their job that their egos will be tied to jobs. Likewise, those who have high work ethics values would feel that unless they work, they are no good, and hence would keep engaging in work behavior. This again is bound to increase the level of motivation. These frequent interactions with work will get them ego involved in the work. Thus, need for achievement and work ethics values will motivate people to work, which in turn would get them ego involved in work. Now, this paragraph basically, again, where it has what it done is basically elaborate the different variables and their relationship, logically defining them in a way and giving you some kind of reasons and explanation why this relationship exists the way they are saying it exists. So based on that, the theoretical framework which could be drawn is that need for achievement and work ethics leads to higher motivation, and higher motivation leads to job involvement. A typical theoretical framework based on the scenario which was given. So as we said, there are two components to a theoretical framework. One, the theory development, the description, the explanation of the relationship, and the logic and the reasoning behind why these relationships exist. And the second part to the theoretical framework is your schematic diagram, which is what we can see there. So it's the mental map which we had described here in the theoretical, in the explanation of the theoretical framework, and this is the mental map of that. What could be the hypothesis which could develop from these? Let's have a look at them. One hypothesis, which is the HA1 states, which is the actual hypothesis, saying the higher the need of achievement, the greater will be the level of motivation. Second thing we're saying, the greater the Protestants' work ethic values people hold, the greater will be their job level of motivation. The third hypothesis is the greater the motivation in individuals, the greater the level of job involvement. So we're saying the higher the need of achievement, the greater the level of motivation. Again, we can see what we can see is this is a directional type of an hypothesis statements. Why? Because we're saying higher and greater. The two variables are need for achievement and motivation. So we're saying there is a relationship between these two, and we're saying it's a positive one. Correct? Another one, the greater the work ethics, Protestant work ethic values, people hold, the greater motivation. Again, two values, work ethics, two variables, and again you can see this relationship is drawn, and then it is saying it's a positive, it's a directional type of hypothesis statement, and we're saying there's a positive relationship between these two. A third hypothesis statement drawn based on the theoretical framework, the greater the motivation level of individual, the greater the job involvement. Again, we're keeping motivation as one variable, job involvement as the second variable. We're saying there is a relationship, and this is also a positive type of a relationship. A fourth and fifth can be developed. It's slightly a different type of hypothesis statement we have not yet seen, but as we said, that apart from the independent dependent variable, we have also the moderating and the mediating variables. Sometimes the researchers would also like to study the mediating or the moderating role of these variables. In the previous scenario, the one we were looking at here, the theoretical framework, if you can look at, this is what we call as your independent variables. This is what we call as your dependent variable. Correct? In between this, do you remember what is this? We were saying when something comes in between the relationship, something which is transformed, which is time bound, say we say this is what we call as an intervening variable or a mediating variable, mediating or an intervening variable, or sometimes you can say it's a mediating variable. What happens is the need of achievement is transformed into motivation, and motivation then influences the job involvement. So we're saying when there is a higher need of achievement, it's transformed into motivation, and motivation then affects the job involvement. In this case, we're saying motivation is basically what we term as a mediating variable, and we can, for testing if this variable mediates between the relationship between need for achievement and motivation, work ethics and motivation and involvement. For them, again, we need to develop a hypothesis statement for this relationship. We could say the need of achievement is basically mediated through by motivation, and it influences job involvement. Similarly, job ethics is basically, we're saying the job ethics is transformed into motivation, which then affects the job involvement. So for this kind of a relationship, one needs to see in that we want to see if there is a mediation effect, or there is an intervening effect. For that, we can develop hypothesis statements such as this: motivation mediates the relationship between need for achievement and job involvement. So we are saying motivation, basically, this is the variable one. We're saying the other variable is need for achievement, and the third variable we have is job involvement. We're saying motivation mediates the relationship. So this is one way of stating that motivation mediates the relationship. Similarly, motivation can also mediate the relationship between work ethics and job involvement. Okay, so we, based on this theoretical framework, we developed our schematic diagram, or the mental map of the relationships. We developed our hypothesis statements, which we would like to prove or disprove, whatever the case is. And once we state this, we basically would like to know that if these hypotheses are holding true or not. Okay, so let's recap what we did so far. We said that, keeping in view the literature, we develop our research questions to address the research problems. In order to statistically respond to the research questions, we develop the hypothesis statements. So literature review gives us a foundation. We read from different literature, the different kind of relationship. It creates in our mind certain questions as to if these certain relationship exists, and if they exist or they don't exist. Then what we do is, based on our intuition, or based on our previous researches, what we do is we tentatively develop our hypothesis statements, which basically need to be proven later on. So these statements are written in such a way that they can be easily proven, and which can be easily testable. Okay. The relationship between, again, hypothesis statement and testing, in between, naturally, before we test them, we need to collect some data from that. And data needs to be collected so that we are able to prove our hypothesis statements or test those hypotheses. The hypothesis statements are written, in which said they're written in the directional or non-directional format. They could be written while they are trying to establish the difference between the two groups, or the relationship between variables. So these are the different ways of formatting or forming our hypothesis statements. And we also said that we also try to write the hypothesis statements in the form of a null and alternate hypothesis statements. Null statements basically state that there is no relationship and there is no group difference between the two groups. Basically the objective is that once we are able to disprove the null hypothesis, we could prove our alternate hypothesis statements. And usually the alternate hypothesis statements are the actual hypothesis statements which we had already established. So in any case, whatever the hypothesis statements we are trying to make, we want to make sure that at the end we could collect data against them and then test and find out if these hypothesis statements hold true or not. Okay, so with that we conclude today's session, and we will for the next session what we'll talk about is what are the different notations we use in formatting hypothesis statements, and what are the different other types of hypothesis statements we can make in such as in the case of the qualitative kind of hypothesis statements, and what are the scenarios when the hypothesis statements are not proven true. So with this, we'll thank you, and we'll continue with it tomorrow. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.